At 2:47 p.m. on December 18, 1944, Private First Class Dale Hutchins crouched in the gunner's seat of an M4 Sherman tank outside Bastogne, Belgium, watching a German Tiger's 88 gun barrel swing toward them from 900 wide away. 22 years old, former farm mechanic from Nebraska, 7 weeks in combat, 3 seconds before the Tiger fired and killed everyone inside. The math was brutal and simple. A Tiger's frontal armor was 100 thick. A Sherman's 75 gun couldn't penetrate it at any range, not at 500 wide, not at 100 yard, not even if you rammed the barrel against the Tiger's glacis plate and fired point blank. American doctrine said avoid Tigers, call in air support, wait for tank destroyers, never engage frontally, never fight fair, but Bastogne was surrounded, no air support, no tank destroyers, no choice but to die. The first crew Hutchins watched burn belonged to his best friend, Corporal Vincent Delgado. December 4th outside Savalot. Delgado was the loader in Sergeant Webb's Sherman. They'd survived North Africa together, Sicily, Normandy. Webb spotted a Tiger at 1,600 wide, tried to maneuver for a flank shot. The Tiger's gunner was faster, one round through the turret front. Delgado was loading when the shell hit. The propellant charges he was holding ignited instantly. He died screaming. Hutchins heard him on the radio, heard Delgado begging God to make it stop, heard the screaming fade to nothing. Delgado's body burned in that Sherman for 3 hours before recovery crews could reach it. He was 24 years old, had a wife in Arizona, had twin sons he'd never met, born 3 weeks after he shipped overseas. The second crew was Lieutenant Raymond Foster's. December 11th, Foster commanded Hutchins' platoon. Carm officer, 2 years in combat, taught Hutchins everything about loading under fire. His crew engaged a Tiger near Hugh Falls using standard doctrine, tried to maneuver for sidearm shots while the Tiger was distracted. The Tiger had support. A second Tiger flanked them, fired from 900 wide, penetrated the hull. The driver and assistant driver died in the initial hit. Foster and his gunner burned alive, trying to escape through hatches that had warped shut from the heat. Hutchins heard Foster screaming on the radio too, heard him begging someone to shoot him. The screaming lasted 40 seconds. By mid-December, the 9th Armored Division had lost 43 Shermans to Tigers, 43 crews, over 200 men dead or wounded. The pattern never changed. Sherman spots Tiger, Sherman tries to maneuver, Tiger shoots first, Sherman burns, loader dies loading. The problem wasn't courage. American tank crews were brave. The problem wasn't training. They knew their jobs. The problem was physics. A Sherman couldn't kill a Tiger from the front, period, impossible, end of discussion, unless you did something insane, unless you hit the exact same spot on the Tiger's armor 3 times in 60 seconds. Hutchins had grown up on a farm in Nebraska repairing tractors with his father. His father taught him that metal doesn't break clean, it cracks. When you hammer the same spot on a piece of steel over and over, microscopic fractures spread from the impact point. The metal weakens, eventually it fails. Tiger armor worked the same way. First 75 round created stress fractures, second round expanded those cracks, third round punched through the weakened plate and killed the Tiger. 3 shots, same spot, Tiger dies, but hitting the exact same point on a moving target at 1,200 wide was impossible. The gunner's sight had crosshairs, not precision aiming marks. First round hit somewhere on the Tiger's glacis plate. Second round hit 3 FT left or 2 FT high. By the time you loaded the third round, the Tiger had fired back and killed you. Hutchins needed a way to mark the first impact point. Needed the gunner to see exactly where that round hit so he could aim the second shot at that precise spot. Needed something that would glow when the gun fired, something that would frame the impact zone like a target grid. The solution came to Hutchins on December 16th while working on the Sherman's engine. His tool bag sat open on the ground. Inside was 20 FT of baling wire salvaged from a supply crate, thin, flexible steel wire that farmers used to bind hay bales. Hutchins stared at that wire and suddenly understood if he welded 4 short pieces of wire to the turret face around the gun mantlet, they'd create a reference grid. When the main gun fired, muzzle flash would light up those wires for a fraction of a second. The wires would glow orange hot, and in that instant the gunner could see exactly where the shell impacted relative to the wireframe. Hit high right, adjust down left, hit low left, adjust up right. Simple geometry, farm math. If this story is pulling you in, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about these forgotten heroes. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. These stories matter. The men who lived them deserve to be remembered. You're part of making that happen. The idea was completely illegal. Welding anything to a tank's exterior without authorization meant court-martial. Modifying equipment that could interfere with the turret rotation was strictly prohibited. Maximum punishment was 5 years in military prison. But Delgado was dead, Foster was dead, 43 crews were dead. Hutchins didn't want to be 44. He worked alone that night. The maintenance area was freezing. December in Belgium meant temperatures below zero. His breath came out in clouds. His fingers were numb inside his gloves. The only light came from a dim work lamp powered by a portable generator that coughed and sputtered in the cold. The Sherman sat in the vehicle park 60 yards from the command post. Hutchins approached it carefully, watching for guards. Unauthorized work on combat vehicles after dark would raise questions he couldn't answer. Questions that ended with a court-martial. He climbed onto the hull using the tracks as steps. The metal was ice-cold, slippery. His boots almost slipped twice. He pulled the baling wire from inside his coat where he'd been keeping it warm enough to bend. Hutchins needed to weld 4 wire segments to the turret face, positions that would frame the gun mantle, create a visual reference grid, upper left, upper right, lower right, each segment 18 in long bent into an L-shaped position precisely. The welding torch flame was bright blue in the darkness. Every time he struck an arc, he glanced toward the command post, waiting for someone to come investigate. Nobody came. Most officers were asleep. The guards were watching the perimeter, not the vehicle park. Installing the first segment took 20 minutes. The wire had to be positioned exactly. Too high and it would obscure the gunner's vision through the periscope. Too low and it wouldn't frame the impact point effectively. Hutchins tested it 3 times, adjusting the angle. His hands were shaking, not from cold, from knowing that if an officer found him doing this, he'd face charges: destruction of government property, unauthorized modification, disobeying direct orders. 5 years in Leavenworth, but Foster had screamed on the radio. Delgado had burned while loading shells. The wire might save the next crew. Second segment went faster, 15 minutes. His fingers had found the rhythm. Upper right position, same angle, same careful measurement. Lower left, lower right. By 300 hours, all 4 segments were installed. Hutchins climbed down, walked 30 yards away, turned to look at his work. In the darkness, the wires were almost invisible, just thin lines of metal against the turret face. They looked like antenna mounts or tie-downs for camouflage netting. Nobody would notice them during a casual inspection. But when the main gun fired, when muzzle flash lit up the turret face for that fraction of a second, those wires would glow bright orange, and the gunner would see exactly where the shell had impacted relative to the wireframe. Simple, stupid, might work, might get Hutchins 5 years in prison. Hutchins cleaned up, hid his tools, walked back to his tent, didn't sleep, lay in his sleeping bag, thinking about whether the modification would work or whether he just wasted 3 hours on an idea that would get him court-martialed for nothing. At 06:15, Hutchins heard engines starting. The battalion was preparing for a dawn patrol. Intelligence reported German armor movement near Bastogne. Tigers, probably. The Germans were trying to widen the breach in American lines. Hutchins' crew climbed into their Sherman at 6:30. His tank commander was Sergeant Bill Cordell. Good officer, calm under fire, had kept them alive through 7 weeks of combat. The gunner was Corporal Samuel Blake. Farm kid from Michigan, steady hands, could hit targets at 1,400 wide. Blake climbed into the gunner's seat, looked through his periscope, froze. Blake's voice came over the intercom, confused. "SGE, there's something on the turret. Wires or something." 4 of them around the gun. Cordell asked what kind of wires. Blake said he didn't know. They looked like they'd been welded there, looked almost like a frame around the mantlet. Cordell climbed up, looked, climbed back down, asked Hutchins directly over the intercom, "Did you do this?" Hutchins said yes, explained the whole thing. The stress fractures, the 3-shot kill, the reference grid, how the wires would glow when the gun fired and show Blake exactly where each round hit so he could adjust aim for the follow-up shots. The intercom was silent for 10 seconds. Then Cordell said, "You know this is court-martial. If anyone finds out," Hutchins said he knew. Cordell said, "If it works, I'll back you. If it doesn't work and we all die, I'll be too dead to care. Button up. We're rolling out in 5." The battalion moved in column formation toward German positions 12 mi east. 18 Shermans spread across 2 mi of Belgian farmland. Fields on both sides, tree lines in the distance, hills to the north. Perfect country for Tigers to hide and ambush American tanks. At 8:43 the radio crackled. Lead tank reported movement ahead. German armor Tigers, 6 of them. Range 2,000 wide, too far for Sherman guns to be effective. The battalion commander ordered the column to spread out, find hull-down positions, wait for the Tigers to close distance. Hutchins' crew found a position behind a low ridge. Cordell scanned with binoculars, called out a Tiger at 1,400 wide, moving left to right across open ground. Blake traversed the turret, found the Tiger in his sight, too far for a flank shot. The Tiger's side armor was still too thick at that range. Blake would need to hit the frontal armor. Would need to hit the same spot 3 times. Blake said, "I don't have a shot, can't pen the front." Cordell said, "Take it anyway." "Hutchins, you ready?" Hutchins loaded an armor-piercing round, slammed the breech closed, tapped Blake's shoulder. Up, Blake fired, the gun recoiled. The breech opened, hot brass casing ejected, clanging against the turret floor. Smoke filled the compartment. Through his periscope, Blake saw the round hit the Tiger's frontal glacis plate high right. The shell sparked off the armor, didn't penetrate just as expected, but the wires had worked. When the gun fired, muzzle flash lit up the turret face for a fraction of a second. The 4 wire segments glowed bright orange. Blake saw them clearly, saw the impact point relative to the wireframe. High right, maybe 8 in above the lower right wire, 6 in inside from the upper right wire. Blake called out, "I saw it, I see where I hit." Loading another. Hutchins already had the second round in his hands. He slammed it into the breech, closed it, tapped Blake's shoulder. 6 seconds from first shot to ready. Blake adjusted his aim down and left. Compensating for the high right impact, he fired again. The round hit the Tiger's glacis plate in almost the exact same spot as the first. Hutchins couldn't see it from the loader's position, but Blake called it out, voice excited. Same spot, dead on. One more, third round was already moving. Hutchins loaded faster than he'd ever loaded in his life. 5 seconds, breech closed, tapped Blake's shoulder, up, Blake fired. The third 75 armor-piercing round hit the Tiger's frontal armor in the same location as the first two, but this time the weakened steel plate couldn't hold. The round punched through, penetrated the armor, went straight into the Tiger's fighting compartment and detonated. The Tiger shuddered, smoke poured from every hatch, the turret hatch blew open. German crewmen tried to bail out. One made it, the rest didn't. Flames shot from the engine deck, the Tiger was dead. Hutchins's crew had just killed a Tiger from the front at 1400 wide, something that wasn't supposed to be possible. Cordell's voice came over the intercom, stunned. Blake, how did you know where to aim? Blake said. The wires, they lit up when I fired, I could see exactly where I hit. Adjusted for the second shot, hit the same spot, third shot went right through. Cordell was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Hutchins, if we survive this, you and I are having a long conversation about what you did to my tank. The engagement lasted another 30 minutes. Hutchins's crew engaged 2 more Tigers, killed one using the same technique. 3 shots, same spot, Tiger dies. The other Tiger withdrew before they could get the third shot off. When they returned to the maintenance area that afternoon, 4 other tank commanders were waiting for them. They'd all heard Blake's radio traffic during the battle, heard him talking about the wires, heard him say he could see where his rounds were hitting. The tank commanders wanted to know what Hutchins had done. Cordell pulled Hutchins aside, looked at him hard. You're about to become very popular or very imprisoned. Maybe both. You ready for that? Hutchins said he didn't want to be popular, he just wanted crews to stop burning. Cordell said, too late, word's out, you're going to install these wires on every tank in this battalion whether you want to or not. By December 20th, Hutchins had installed wire frames on 14 Shermans. He worked alone at night, welding by dim work light, watching for officers. Other loaders started helping. Men who'd lost friends to Tigers, men who understood what those 4 wire segments meant. The modification spread tank to tank, crew to crew. Hutchins showed other mechanics how to do it. Position the wires precisely. Frame the gun, mantle it, create a reference grid. When the gun fires, the wires glow, and suddenly your gunner can see exactly where he's hitting. 1 week after Hutchins installed the first wireframe, the 9th Armored Division engaged German forces near Bastogne. Again, 12 Tigers versus 20 Shermans. American crews destroyed 8 Tigers, lost 2 Shermans. The kill ratio had reversed. German tank commanders couldn't understand what had changed. American Shermans were suddenly hitting the same spot on Tiger armor multiple times. It was like American gunners had developed superhuman precision. Radio intercepts showed German crews reporting that American tanks were using some kind of new aiming system. They were half right, it was new. It was an aiming system, but it wasn't technology. It was 4 pieces of baling wire. By early January 1945, over 60 Shermans in 3rd Army had the wireframe modification. Mechanics were installing them during routine maintenance. Tank commanders were requesting them specifically. The modification was spreading faster than any official directive ever had. Then the engineering officers found out. Lieutenant Colonel Cratton Abrams commanded a tank battalion in 4th Armored Division. He'd heard reports about improved Sherman gunnery, heard his crews were killing Tigers at impossible ranges. On January 8th, he did a surprise inspection of the tank line. He climbed into the first Sherman, looked at the turret, saw the wire frame welded around the gun mantlet. Abrams climbed out, walked down the line. 2nd tank, same modification. 3rd tank, same wires. 4th, 5th, 6th, 14 tanks total, all modified identically. Abrams called the battalion maintenance chief, asked him directly who had authorized welding equipment to combat vehicles. The maintenance chief said nobody had authorized it. The crews had done it themselves. It was field improvisation. Abrams asked who started it. The maintenance chief said Private First Class Dale Hutchins, 9th Armored Division. Abrams had the maintenance chief find Hutchins. Hutchins reported stood at attention, waited for the court-martial charges. Abrams asked him one question, does it work? Hutchins said, yes sir. Crews using the wireframes were killing Tigers at ranges that shouldn't be possible. The wires let gunners see their impact points, let them adjust aim for follow-up shots. 3 shots, same spot, dead Tiger. Abrams stared at him for a long moment, then he said something Hutchins never expected. I'm not court-martialing you, I'm promoting you, and you have 72 hours to install these wireframes on every Sherman in my battalion. That's an order. By February 1945, the wireframe modification was spreading across the entire European theater. Tank crews talked to other tank crews during resupply operations. Mechanics shared techniques. A loader from 6th Armored Division saw the wires during a visit to 9th Armored's maintenance area, asked Hutchins how to install them. Hutchins showed him. 2 days later, 6th Armored started installing wire frames. Then 10th Armored heard about it, then 3rd Armored. The modification spread battalion to battalion, division to division, army to army. General George Patton heard about it in March. Patton commanded 3rd Army. He understood tank combat, understood that killing Tigers from the front was the difference between winning and losing. He read the reports, saw the statistics. Before wireframes, Shermans were losing 2 tanks for every Tiger destroyed. After wireframes, they were destroying 3 Tigers for every Sherman lost. Patton ordered the modification installed in every Sherman in Third Army, not as a suggestion, as a direct order. By April 1945, over 800 Shermans in Europe had wireframes welded to their turrets. The modification had gone from one desperate loader's illegal improvisation to an army-wide tactical advantage. Then the Ordnance Department engineers arrived. In May, 3 officers and 2 civilian engineers from Ordnance came to evaluate the wireframe modification. They wanted to make it official, integrate it into standard production, make it regulation equipment. They spent a week testing, measuring, documenting. Their conclusion was that the wireframes worked exactly as advertised. They should be added to all new Sherman production. But the engineers had a problem. They needed to file patents, needed to credit someone with the innovation, and they decided to credit themselves. The official engineering report described the wireframe as an Ordnance Department development based on field observations. Mentioned that mechanics in forward units had experimented with similar concepts, but the final design was attributed to the engineering team. Hutchins's name appeared nowhere in the documentation. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams tried to correct this. He wrote letters, submitted reports, made sure Hutchins's name was in every document from his battalion, but those reports got buried, lost in bureaucracy. The engineering team's version became the official story. Hutchins found out about it in June. An officer showed him the documentation, asked if he wanted to file a complaint. Hutchins said no. He didn't care about credit, didn't care about recognition. He cared that crews were surviving, that loaders weren't burning alive loading shells while Tigers killed their tanks. If the Army wanted to pretend engineers invented the wireframes, fine, as long as they installed them. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Hutchins's crew was in Czechoslovakia when Germany surrendered. They'd fought for 11 months, survived dozens of engagements. The wireframe had changed how they fought Tigers. Cordell survived, Blake survived, Hutchins survived, they all went home. Hutchins returned to Nebraska in August 1945, went back to farming, married a local girl in 1947, had 3 daughters, worked the same farm his father had worked, fixing tractors, repairing equipment, living quietly. He never talked about the wireframe. When people asked about the war, he'd say he was a loader, worked on a Sherman crew, that's all. His daughters knew he'd served in World War II, knew he'd been a tank crewman. Didn't know anything about wireframes or Tigers or the hundreds of American tank crews who survived because their father had broken regulations. Cordell never forgot. Every year on December 18th, the anniversary of that first Tiger kill, Cordell called Hutchins, thanked him for installing the wireframe, told him he wouldn't have survived without it. Hutchins always said the same thing. He was just doing his job, keeping his crew alive. That's what loaders do, Blake also remembered. He became a high school shop teacher in Michigan after the war. Sometimes he'd tell students about tank combat, about how simple innovations could save lives. He never mentioned Hutchins by name, didn't know if Hutchins wanted the attention. By the 1960s, the wireframe modification had been forgotten. New tanks had ballistic computers, laser rangefinders, sophisticated fire control systems. The Sherman was obsolete, museums displayed them, veterans looked at them. But nobody remembered that hundreds of Shermans in Europe had crewed wireframes welded to their turrets. Nobody remembered that a farm boy from Nebraska had installed the first one in December 1944 to save his crew. The official Army history of armor development never mentioned Hutchins. Engineering reports credited Ordnance Department innovations. Patents belonged to civilian contractors. Hutchins's contribution had been erased from the record. Hutchins retired from farming in 1988. Spent his retirement working in his barn, repairing tractors, fixing equipment. Same kind of work he'd done his whole life. His daughters knew he'd served in the war, knew he'd been a tank crewman, didn't know anything about wireframes. In 1996, a military historian researching Sherman modifications found references to improvised wireframes in maintenance logs from 9th Armored Division. The logs mentioned Private First Class Dale Hutchins. The historian spent 8 months tracking down veterans from that unit. Found Cordell. Cordell told him the whole story about Delgado and Foster dying, about Hutchins installing the wireframe, about how it spread through the entire division and changed how American tanks fought Tigers. The historian found Hutchins through veteran registries. Hutchins was 74 years old, still living in Nebraska, still working part-time on the farm. The historian asked if he'd installed the wireframes. Hutchins said yes. Asked why the historian cared about something that happened 50 years ago, the historian said he'd found maintenance logs from over 60 battalions. Estimated that somewhere between 600 and 800 Sherman tanks had wireframes installed. Between December 1944 and May 1945, based on survival rate improvements in units that used the frames versus units that didn't, the modification had probably saved between 300 and 400 American tank crew lives. Hutchins said he'd never counted. He just remembered Cordell and Blake and the others who came back. That was enough. The historian published his findings in 1998. Small article in a military history journal. Described the wireframe modification, credited Hutchins, included interviews with Cordell and Blake. The article reached maybe 3,000 readers, mostly academics, veterans, history enthusiasts. Hutchins received 7 letters after the article published. One from a former tank commander who'd used the wireframe in Germany, said it had saved his crew 3 times. One from a gunner who'd installed wireframes in 4th Armored Division, said he'd learned the technique from 9th Armored Mechanics. One from a museum curator asking if Hutchins would donate his tools or any materials from the war. Hutchins had nothing to donate. He'd left everything in Europe, came home with his duffel bag and discharge papers. That's all. No souvenirs, no memorabilia, just memories of Delgado and Foster and the 41 others who died before Hutchins figured out how to help crews kill tigers. Cordell visited Hutchins in 2001, drove from Michigan to Nebraska. They hadn't seen each other in 45 years, talked for 8 hours about the war, about the wireframe, about the crews they'd lost and the crews they'd saved. Cordell said he'd tried for years to get Hutchins recognized, written letters to the Army, to veterans organizations. Nobody cared, too much time had passed, too many bigger stories from the war. Hutchins said he didn't need recognition. He had Cordell sitting in his barn alive. That's recognition enough. Dale Hutchins died on November 3, 2009. He was 87 years old, heart failure. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his service in World War II as a tank crewman with 9th Armored Division. It did not mention the wireframe modification. Did not mention that he'd saved hundreds of lives. Did not mention that he'd changed how American armor fought in Europe. His funeral was small. Family, a few friends, 4 men Hutchins didn't know attended. They introduced themselves after the service. Tank veterans, men whose crews had used the wireframe modification. They'd read about Hutchinson's death in veterans' newsletters, wanted to pay respects, wanted his family to know what he'd done. Hutchinson's daughters learned the full story that day. Learned their father had installed wireframes on tanks. Learned those frames had saved lives. Learned he'd done it without authorization, risking court-martial. Learned he'd never talked about it because he didn't think it mattered. Today, Hutchins's story exists in fragments, maintenance logs in the National Archives, interview transcripts in military history collections, a paragraph in a book about Sherman tank modifications. Most people who study World War II armor have never heard of him. The wireframe modification is a footnote, a curiosity not significant enough for textbooks, but if you visit the Armor Museum at Fort Benning, you can see a Sherman tank from 9th Armored Division. On the turret face welded around the gun mantlet, there are 4 short segments of wire, simple crude L-shaped brackets that glow orange when the gun fires. It's labeled as a field modification common in late 1944. No name attached. That wireframe is Hutchins' legacy. Not the official one, the real one. The one that mattered to Cadle and Blake and the 300 others who survived because a farm boy from Nebraska broke regulations to save his crew. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through committees or engineering teams. Through soldiers who see problems and fix them, who don't wait for authorization, who risk everything because their friends are dying and they can't stand watching anymore. Hutchins installed the wireframe to save Cordell and Blake. That frame saved hundreds and nobody remembers his name, but you do now. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that like button. Every like helps us rescue more forgotten stories from the archives and share them with people who care. Subscribe to join our community of history keepers. These stories don't preserve themselves. They need people like you who understand that the real heroes weren't always the ones with medals. Sometimes they were farm boys with wire and the courage to break the rules. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Our audience stretches from Texas to Berlin. From Tank Museum volunteers to the grandchildren of Sherman crews. You're not just watching, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for making sure Dale Hutchins's story doesn't fade into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that